In the labyrinthine corridors of power, where ambition collides with betrayal and where the weak are consumed by their own thirst for vengeance, there exists a different path, one walked by those who understand that true strength lies not in striking back, but in rising above. This is the story of how the most powerful individuals in history have mastered the art of silent healing, transforming their wounds into wisdom and their scars into stepping stones toward unprecedented influence. The concept of power has been misunderstood for millennia. Society teaches us that power comes from the ability to inflict pain upon those who have wronged us, that strength is measured by the ferocity of our response to betrayal. But those who truly understand the mechanics of influence know a secret that eludes the masses. The most devastating weapon against one's enemies is not revenge, but the complete transformation of oneself into someone so formidable that the very people who once sought to destroy you begin to seek your approval. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor who ruled the Roman Empire at its zenith, faced constant plots against his life, betrayals from trusted advisors, and the burden of maintaining order over an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. His generals questioned his decisions, senators conspired behind closed doors, and even his own son proved to be a disappointment that threatened everything he had built. Yet in his private writings we find not a single word of vengeance planned or executed. Instead, we discover a man who used each betrayal as a chisel to carve away the weak aspects of his character. When Avidius Cassius, one of his most trusted generals, declared himself emperor and rallied entire legions to his cause, Marcus could have responded with the full fury of imperial wrath. He had the power to crucify not just Cassius, but every soldier who had followed him, to burn entire cities that had proclaimed their allegiance to the usurper. Instead, he chose a different path. He announced publicly that if Cassius truly was a better emperor, he would willingly step aside. He declared that if he himself proved unworthy, he would welcome death as a natural consequence. This response so stunned the Roman world that Cassius's own supporters began to question their rebellion. Before Marcus even reached the eastern provinces to confront the uprising, Cassius was dead, killed not by imperial agents, but by his own followers who realized they had supported the wrong man. This was not weakness masquerading as strength. This was strength so absolute that it transformed enemies into admirers without a single drop of blood being shed in anger. Marcus had discovered what modern psychology would later term the paradox of power. The moment you stop needing to prove your strength, you become truly formidable. The principle extends far beyond the realm of ancient emperors. In the modern corporate world, we see this dynamic play out repeatedly. Consider the career trajectory of Satya Nadella, who became CEO of Microsoft in 2014. When he assumed leadership, the company was hemorrhaging market share to Google and Apple. Its culture was toxic with internal competition, and many industry observers considered Microsoft a dying giant. Nadella had every reason to seek revenge on the internal factions that had resisted his vision, to purge the company of those who had undermined previous initiatives, to prove his worth through displays of dominance. Instead, he chose the path of silent transformation. He began by acknowledging publicly that Microsoft had lost its way, that the company's previous culture of internal competition had weakened it. Rather than punishing those who had contributed to this culture, he invited them to participate in rebuilding it. He replaced the performance review system that pitted employees against each other with one that rewarded collaboration. He shifted the company's focus from protecting its existing monopolies to creating new value for customers. The results were profound. Within 6 years under Nadella's leadership, Microsoft's market capitalization grew from $300 billion to over $2 trillion. The employees who might have been his enemies in a different scenario became his most passionate advocates. The company culture transformed from one of internal warfare to one of collective mission. Nadella had achieved something that no amount of corporate revenge could have accomplished. He had made his organization so powerful that competitors began copying Microsoft's strategies rather than attacking its weaknesses. This transformation was not accidental. It followed a pattern that repeats throughout history, whenever individuals choose the path of silent healing over the immediate gratification of revenge. The pattern consists of 3 distinct phases, each building upon the previous one, each requiring a level of self-discipline that most people cannot maintain when their pride has been wounded and their trust betrayed. Part 1. The Alchemy of Inner Destruction. The first phase of silent healing begins with perhaps the most difficult task any human being can undertake, the deliberate destruction of one's weak self. This is not the destruction that comes from external circumstances. the loss of a job, the end of a relationship, the collapse of carefully laid plans. This is the intentional dismantling of the aspects of personality and character that make one vulnerable to manipulation, that create dependencies on others' approval, that transform setbacks into identity crises. Most people experience betrayal as an assault on their core identity. When a trusted friend reveals their secrets, when a business partner steals their ideas, when a romantic partner chooses someone else, the natural response is to feel that something essential about themselves has been damaged. They begin to question their judgment, their worth, their ability to navigate the world successfully. This response, while natural, is also the foundation of perpetual weakness. It places one's sense of self in the hands of others, making personal power contingent on external validation, and leaving one vulnerable to future manipulation by anyone clever enough to exploit these dependencies. The individuals who master silent healing approach betrayal and setback differently. They view these experiences as diagnostic tools, revealing precisely which aspects of their character require strengthening. When someone betrays their trust, they ask not, "How could they do this to me?" but rather, "What weakness in my character made this betrayal possible?" When a plan fails, they investigate not just the external circumstances that led to failure, but the internal assumptions and blind spots that prevented them from anticipating and preparing for those circumstances. This process requires a level of intellectual honesty that most people find unbearable. It demands that one take responsibility not just for their actions, but for their reactions, not just for their choices, but for their vulnerabilities. It means acknowledging that every person who has ever successfully manipulated or betrayed them was able to do so because they provided the weapons for their own destruction. Consider the early career of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, before he became one of the most powerful presidents in American history. As a young politician in New York, Roosevelt was ambitious, idealistic, and remarkably naive about the nature of political power. He believed that good intentions and eloquent speeches would be sufficient to drive change. He trusted colleagues who spoke his language of reform, assuming that shared ideals meant shared integrity. He was repeatedly outmaneuvered by more experienced politicians who used his idealism against him, promising support they never intended to deliver and extracting concessions for legislation they would later sabotage. The culmination of this education came in 1920, when Roosevelt ran for vice president on the Democratic ticket with James Cox. The campaign was a disaster. Roosevelt discovered that many of the party leaders who had publicly supported the ticket were privately working to ensure its failure. Believing that a loss in 1920 would position them better for 1924, he learned that his own statements were being deliberately misrepresented by people he considered allies, that his campaign appearances were being scheduled to minimize rather than maximize his effectiveness, that even his running mate was more concerned with preserving his own political future than with winning the election. The loss was crushing, but it was what happened next that revealed Roosevelt's true character. Instead of raging against the betrayals, instead of plotting revenge against those who had sabotaged his ambitions, he began a systematic analysis of his own weaknesses. He identified his tendency to trust too quickly, his assumption that others shared his motivations, his failure to verify promises with concrete commitments. Most importantly, he recognized that his need to be liked had made him vulnerable to manipulation by anyone skilled enough to offer the appearance of friendship and support. Then, in 1921, Roosevelt contracted polio. The disease paralyzed his legs and confined him to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. For most politicians, this would have meant the end of their career. Physical weakness was seen as incompatible with political power, and Roosevelt's opponents were quick to suggest that his condition made him unfit for leadership. But Roosevelt used his physical limitations as an opportunity to complete the destruction of his weak self. He spent the next several years deliberately developing the aspects of his character that his earlier setbacks had revealed as deficient. He learned to read people's motivations not through their words but through their actions. He developed the patience to allow events to unfold rather than forcing premature conclusions. He cultivated the ability to maintain multiple relationships simultaneously without becoming emotionally dependent on any of them. Most crucially, he learned to derive his sense of self-worth from his own assessment of his actions rather than from others' approval. When Roosevelt returned to politics in the late 1920s, his colleagues barely recognized him. Where once he had been eager to please, he was now selectively gracious. Where once he had been impulsive, he was now deliberate. Where once he had been transparent, he was now strategically opaque. He had destroyed the version of himself that could be easily betrayed and replaced it with someone who understood that trust was a tool to be deployed tactically, rather than an emotion to be felt indiscriminately. This transformation was not a hardening into cynicism. Roosevelt retained his idealistic goals and his genuine concern for others' welfare, but he had separated his emotional attachments from his strategic calculations. He could work closely with someone he neither liked nor trusted if doing so served his larger purposes. He could abandon an ally who had become a liability without experiencing it as a personal betrayal. He had achieved what psychologists now call secure attachment, the ability to form relationships without making one's identity dependent on their continuation. The results of this transformation became apparent during Roosevelt's presidency. When Congress attempted to block his New Deal legislation, he did not respond with angry speeches or partisan attacks. Instead, he used radio broadcasts to speak directly to the American people, building popular pressure that made congressional resistance politically costly. When members of his own party attempted to limit his authority, he did not purge them from leadership positions. Instead, he created new institutions and appointed new personnel who bypassed the existing power structure entirely. When the Supreme Court ruled against his programs, he did not rage against judicial overreach. Instead, he proposed expanding the court, a move that ultimately failed but demonstrated his willingness to challenge any institution that stood in his way. Throughout these battles, Roosevelt maintained the appearance of gracious leadership. He continued to work with those who opposed him, continued to include them in important meetings and ceremonies, continued to speak of them publicly with respect, but privately, he was systematically removing their ability to obstruct his agenda. He had learned that the most effective form of power is the kind that others do not recognize as power, until it is too late to resist it. This pattern of inner destruction followed by strategic reconstruction can be observed throughout history in individuals who achieved lasting influence rather than temporary dominance. They learned to identify and eliminate the parts of themselves that made them predictable, that created emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited, that tied their self-worth to external validation. The process is neither quick nor comfortable. It requires one to become comfortable with solitude, since the work of self-examination cannot be done in the presence of others who might try to comfort or redirect the process. It requires one to become comfortable with uncertainty, since destroying one's current self without guarantees about what will replace it takes tremendous faith in one's ability to adapt and grow. It requires one to become comfortable with being misunderstood, since the person who emerges from this process will often behave in ways that confuse those who knew them before. But for those who complete this transformation, the rewards extend far beyond personal resilience. They discover that once they no longer need others' approval to maintain their sense of self, they become paradoxically more attractive to others. Once they no longer fear betrayal because they have eliminated the weaknesses that make betrayal possible, they become more trustworthy partners and more formidable opponents. Once they no longer react emotionally to setbacks because they have learned to view them as information rather than injuries, they become more effective at achieving their long-term goals. This is the first secret of silent healing. True power begins with the destruction of the weak self, the version of oneself that can be manipulated, betrayed, and controlled by others. Only when this destruction is complete can the work of building genuine strength begin. Part 2. The Architecture of Invisible Power. Once the weak self has been systematically dismantled, the second phase of silent healing can begin. The construction of influence that operates beneath the conscious awareness of others. This is not the crude domination that announces itself through displays of force or the petty manipulation that seeks immediate gratification at others' expense. This is the patient cultivation of conditions that make one's success inevitable, while allowing others to believe they are acting according to their own free will. The masters of this approach understand that visible power is vulnerable power. The moment others recognize the extent of one's influence, they begin to develop strategies to counter it. They form coalitions. They create alternative power centers. They look for weaknesses to exploit. But influence that operates below the threshold of conscious recognition faces no such resistance because its targets do not realize they need to defend against it. This principle was understood with remarkable clarity by Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister to King Louis XIII of France in the early 17th century. When Richelieu assumed power, France was a nation in crisis. The nobility were in constant rebellion against royal authority. Foreign enemies were exploiting French weaknesses, and the king himself was young, inexperienced, and easily influenced by competing factions. Traditional approaches to these problems, military force against rebellious nobles, diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers, direct commands to the king, had all failed repeatedly under previous ministers. Richelieu chose a different strategy. Instead of confronting the nobility directly, he began to systematically alter the economic and social conditions that made rebellion possible. He introduced new forms of taxation that made it financially ruinous for nobles to maintain private armies. He created new career opportunities in royal service that were more attractive than feudal independence. He established new social rituals at court that made proximity to the king a source of prestige, drawing the nobility away from their rural power bases and into environments where he could monitor and influence their behavior. These changes were introduced gradually, each one appearing to be a reasonable response to immediate circumstances rather than part of a comprehensive strategy. The nobles who found themselves financially dependent on royal favor did not recognize this as a deliberate weakening of their independence. The courtiers who competed for the king's attention did not realize they were participating in their own domestication. Even the king himself did not fully understand how Richelieu was systematically eliminating alternative sources of authority within the realm. The genius of this approach was that it created willing compliance. The nobles chose to abandon their rebellions because rebellion had become economically irrational. The king chose to rely on Richelieu's counsel because Richelieu had made himself indispensable to royal success. Foreign enemies found themselves dealing with a France that was unified and powerful because the sources of internal division had been quietly eliminated. When Richelieu died in 1642, France had been transformed from a weak, divided nation into the dominant power in Europe. Yet throughout this transformation, Richelieu had maintained the appearance of humble service to the king. He had never claimed credit for French successes, never demanded public recognition for his strategies, never positioned himself as anything more than a loyal servant implementing his master's will. His influence had been so thoroughly embedded in the structure of French governance that it continued to operate effectively even after his death. This model of invisible power can be observed in contexts far removed from 17th century French politics. Consider the career of Catherine Graham, who became publisher of the Washington Post after her husband's suicide in 1963. When she assumed control of the newspaper, the Post was a second-tier publication in a highly competitive media market. Graham herself was considered an unlikely leader. She had no journalism background, limited business experience, and was operating in an industry dominated by men who regarded her as a temporary placeholder until more qualified leadership could be found. Graham could have attempted to establish her authority through dramatic gestures, firing prominent editors, changing the newspaper's political orientation, or making bold business acquisitions. Instead, she chose to build her influence through what appeared to be modest improvements in existing operations. She began attending editorial meetings not to issue commands, but to ask questions that revealed her growing understanding of journalism. She started scheduling lunches with other publishers not to negotiate alliances, but to learn industry best practices. She initiated budget reviews not to impose cost cuts, but to understand the economic realities of newspaper publishing. Each of these activities appeared unremarkable to those who observed them. Editors saw her questions as natural curiosity from someone learning the business. Publishers viewed her inquiries as appropriate professional development. Staff members interpreted her budget reviews as responsible oversight. But collectively, these activities were transforming Graham from a figurehead into a sophisticated media executive. The transformation became apparent during the Pentagon Papers crisis in 1971, when the New York Times was prevented by court order from continuing to publish classified documents about American involvement in Vietnam. Graham faced the decision of whether the Post should pick up the story. The risks were enormous. The newspaper could face criminal charges, advertisers might boycott, the government might retaliate against other Post interests. Many of her advisors urged caution, but Graham's years of quiet preparation had given her both the knowledge and the credibility to make this decision confidently. She understood the legal precedents well enough to assess the real risks. She had built relationships with sources who could verify the importance of the story. She had established her competence sufficiently that her editors trusted her judgment even when it conflicted with their own instincts. Most importantly, she had developed the internal confidence to act decisively without needing consensus from others. The Post's decision to publish the Pentagon Papers established it as a major force in American journalism. But this success was possible only because Graham had spent 8 years building the capabilities and relationships necessary to seize such an opportunity. She had created a foundation of invisible power that allowed her to act boldly when boldness was required. The architecture of invisible power operates on several levels simultaneously. At the most basic level, it involves the systematic development of capabilities that others do not recognize as sources of power until they are deployed. This might mean acquiring technical skills that seem peripheral to one's primary responsibilities, developing relationships that appear social rather than strategic, or gaining knowledge in areas that others consider irrelevant to immediate concerns. At a deeper level, it involves the careful management of others' perceptions and expectations. The individual building invisible power allows others to underestimate their capabilities, to assume their motivations are simpler than they actually are, to believe they understand the full extent of the power dynamics at play when they are actually seeing only the surface level. At the deepest level, it involves the patient restructuring of the environments in which one operates, so that one's preferred outcomes become the natural result of others' rational choices. This is the most sophisticated form of influence because it eliminates the need for ongoing persuasion or coercion. Once the environment has been properly structured, others will choose to act in ways that serve one's interests because those actions serve their interests as well. This approach requires extraordinary patience and self-discipline. It means accepting that others will often receive credit for successes that one has orchestrated. It means tolerating being underestimated or ignored while one's capabilities develop. It means resisting the temptation to reveal the full extent of one's influence even when doing so might provide immediate satisfaction or advantage. But for those who master this approach, the rewards are substantial and lasting. They discover that influence built slowly and invisibly is much more durable than power seized quickly and obviously. They find that others become invested in their success because they have been allowed to participate in creating it. They learn that the most effective way to control outcomes is to make those outcomes appear to be the natural result of circumstances rather than the product of deliberate manipulation. The second secret of silent healing is that true influence operates below the conscious awareness of others. It shapes the conditions in which decisions are made rather than attempting to control the decisions themselves. It creates environments where one's preferred outcomes become the obvious choices for rational actors pursuing their own interests. Part 3. The Transcendence of the Destroyer. The final phase of silent healing represents perhaps the most profound transformation any human being can achieve. The evolution from someone who has been destroyed by others into someone who has become indestructible through self-mastery. This is not the brittle invulnerability of the person who avoids all risks or the hollow bravado of the person who pretends immunity to pain. This is the genuine transcendence that comes from having eliminated every internal weakness that others might exploit while maintaining the capacity for authentic connection and genuine care. Those who reach this stage have moved beyond the ordinary cycle of injury and recovery that characterizes most human experience. They have developed what might be called anti-fragility, the quality of becoming stronger rather than weaker under stress, of transforming challenges into opportunities for growth rather than threats to be endured. They have learned to metabolize betrayal, setback, and opposition as raw materials for further development rather than as injuries that require healing. This transformation is visible in the later career of Nelson Mandela, though few people understand the true nature of what made his approach so devastatingly effective. When Mandela was released from prison in 1990, he faced a situation that would have broken most leaders. He had spent 27 years imprisoned by a regime that had systematically oppressed his people. He had watched from his cell as his colleagues were tortured and killed, as his family suffered harassment and poverty, as his dreams of rapid liberation were repeatedly crushed by political realities. The natural response would have been to emerge from prison burning with righteous anger, demanding immediate justice, seeking to punish those who had perpetrated decades of systematic cruelty. Indeed, many of his supporters expected exactly this response. They had suffered while he was imprisoned, and they looked to him to validate their anger, to lead them in settling scores with their oppressors. Instead, Mandela emerged from prison as something unprecedented, a man who had used his suffering to develop capabilities that his oppressors could not even comprehend, let alone counter. He understood that revenge would perpetuate the cycle of racial conflict that had defined South African politics for generations. He recognized that even successful revenge would leave the fundamental structures of oppression intact, simply reversing the positions of oppressor and oppressed rather than creating genuine transformation. More importantly, Mandela had learned something during his imprisonment that his enemies could not anticipate. He had discovered that their power over him was entirely dependent on his cooperation. They could imprison his body, but only if he allowed his identity to be defined by his circumstances. They could inflict suffering, but only if he interpreted that suffering as damage to his essential self. They could attempt to break his spirit, but only if he agreed that his spirit was something that could be broken by external circumstances. By refusing this cooperation, By maintaining his sense of purpose and dignity regardless of his external circumstances, Mandela had achieved something his oppressors could not counter. He had made their power over him contingent on his consent, and by withdrawing that consent, he had transformed himself from a victim into something far more dangerous. A man who could not be controlled because he had eliminated the internal mechanisms through which control operates. This transformation was not merely personal. Mandela understood that his individual invulnerability could become a template for collective liberation. If he could demonstrate that apartheid's power was ultimately dependent on its victims' psychological cooperation, he could teach others to withdraw that cooperation as well. If he could show that dignity and purpose were internal qualities that no external force could destroy, he could inspire an entire population to reclaim their own agency. The genius of Mandela's post-prison strategy was that it turned the apartheid government's greatest strength into its greatest weakness. The regime's power had always rested on the assumption that white South Africans were fundamentally different from and superior to black South Africans. This assumption justified the entire system of racial separation and white privilege. But Mandela's approach implicitly denied the validity of these racial categories by treating all South Africans as equally capable of moral growth and political participation. When Mandela sat down to negotiate with his former captors, he did not approach them as enemies to be defeated, but as fellow human beings who had been trapped by a system that diminished everyone it touched. He acknowledged their legitimate concerns about personal safety and economic security in a post-apartheid South Africa. He included them in designing the transition process rather than imposing solutions upon them. Most importantly, he offered them the opportunity to be part of creating something better rather than simply defending something obsolete. This approach was profoundly disorienting to white South African leaders who had prepared for negotiations by anticipating demands for revenge and retribution. They had developed strategies for resisting black nationalism, for protecting white interests against black anger, for managing a transition that they assumed would be imposed upon them by force. But Mandela's actual approach gave them no clear enemy to resist and no obvious threat to defend against. Instead, they found themselves dealing with someone who seemed genuinely interested in their concerns, who acknowledged the complexity of their situation, who offered them real participation in designing solutions rather than simply demanding their surrender. The psychological effect was to transform them from defenders of an unjust system into participants in creating a just one. They began to see themselves not as victims of inevitable historical change, but as agents of positive transformation. The results were extraordinary. The transition from apartheid to democracy occurred with far less violence than anyone had predicted. The white population, rather than engaging in massive resistance or emigration, largely accepted the new political order. Many white South Africans who had supported apartheid became genuine supporters of the new democratic government. The international community, which had expected years of civil war and economic collapse, instead witnessed what seemed like a miraculous transformation. But this outcome was not miraculous. It was the predictable result of Mandela's understanding that true power lies not in the ability to force others to submit, but in the ability to inspire them to participate willingly in creating something better than what existed before. He had achieved this by making himself into someone who could not be destroyed by others because he had already destroyed the parts of himself that made destruction possible. This principle extends far beyond the realm of political liberation. Consider the transformation of Steve Jobs during his second tenure as CEO of Apple, which began in 1997. When Jobs returned to the company he had co-founded, Apple was widely considered a failing enterprise. The company had lost its way during his 12-year absence, releasing a confusing array of products that satisfied no clear market needs, hemorrhaging talented employees to competitors, and watching its market share decline precipitously. The conventional wisdom was that Apple needed to become more like its successful competitors, Microsoft, Dell, Compaq, by focusing on cost reduction, market share growth, and incremental improvements to existing products. Most business leaders in Jobs' position would have spent their time analyzing competitor strategies, hiring consultants to identify best practices, and implementing proven approaches to corporate turnaround. Instead, Jobs chose a strategy that seemed to violate every principle of sound business management. Rather than trying to compete in existing markets, he decided to create entirely new markets. Rather than reducing costs to match competitors' prices, he decided to command premium prices by offering unprecedented value. Rather than appeasing existing customers with familiar products, he decided to give them products they didn't know they wanted until they experienced them. This approach required Jobs to make himself and his company essentially immune to conventional competitive attacks. If Apple was creating new markets rather than competing in existing ones, traditional market share calculations became irrelevant. If Apple was commanding premium prices through superior design and user experience, cost-cutting strategies by competitors would only make their products seem more inferior by comparison. If Apple was anticipating customer needs rather than responding to customer requests, competitor attempts to copy Apple's successes would always be at least one generation behind. Jobs had learned during his absence from Apple that sustainable competitive advantage comes not from doing the same things as competitors but better, but from doing different things that competitors cannot easily replicate. He had observed that companies fail not because they cannot execute their strategies effectively, but because their strategies depend on conditions they cannot control. He had realized that true business success requires making one's company so distinctive that competition becomes largely irrelevant. The implementation of this vision required Jobs to develop capabilities that his competitors did not even recognize as relevant to business success. He studied industrial design with the same intensity that most CEOs devote to financial analysis. He cultivated aesthetic sensibilities that allowed him to recognize beauty and elegance in ways that could be translated into product features. He developed an intuitive understanding of how people interact with technology that was more sophisticated than most formal market research. These capabilities were largely invisible to competitors because they did not fit conventional categories of business skill. Financial analysts could not quantify the value of superior design. Marketing executives could not reverse engineer Apple's approach to customer needs anticipation. Manufacturing experts could not replicate the integration of form and function that made Apple products distinctive. The result was that Apple became essentially immune to traditional competitive attacks. When competitors tried to match Apple's prices, their products seemed inferior. When they tried to copy Apple's designs, their products seemed derivative. When they tried to anticipate Apple's next moves, they found themselves responding to problems that Apple had already solved and moved beyond. By the time of Jobs' death in 2011, Apple had become the most valuable company in the world, with a market capitalization that exceeded the combined value of most of its major competitors. But perhaps more importantly, Apple had established a template for business success that other companies tried to copy but could never fully replicate because it was based on capabilities that could not be easily transferred or reproduced. Jobs had achieved what might be called competitive transcendence, the elimination of competition through the development of capabilities that others could not match. He had made Apple indestructible not by building better defenses against competitive attacks, but by evolving beyond the level where such attacks were relevant. This pattern of transcendence through self-development can be observed throughout history in individuals and organizations that achieved lasting rather than temporary success. They discovered that the most effective defense against destruction by others is the cultivation of capabilities that make such destruction impossible rather than merely difficult. The process of transcendence follows a predictable pattern. It begins with the recognition that one's current level of development contains inherent limitations that make certain forms of failure inevitable. It continues with the systematic elimination of these limitations through deliberate practice and self-transformation. It culminates in the achievement of capabilities that operate on a different level from those of potential competitors or enemies. Those who achieve this transcendence discover that they no longer need to fear betrayal, competition, or opposition, because they have developed beyond the level where these forces can harm them. They find that others begin to seek their guidance and approval, rather than looking for ways to undermine their success. They learn that the most powerful form of influence is the kind that inspires others to develop themselves rather than simply compelling them to submit. The final secret of silent healing is that true invulnerability comes not from building better defenses, but from evolving beyond the level where attacks are possible. The man who destroys his weak self and replaces it with capabilities that others cannot match becomes impossible to destroy because he has eliminated the weaknesses that make destruction possible. He has achieved something that no external force can threaten. Self-mastery so complete that his success depends entirely on his own choices rather than on circumstances he cannot control. In the end, silent healing reveals itself to be more than a strategy for recovery from betrayal or setback. It is a path to a fundamentally different way of being in the world, one characterized by genuine freedom from the fears and dependencies that limit most human experience. Those who complete this journey discover that they have not merely survived their destroyers, they have evolved beyond the level where destroyers have any power to operate. They have achieved the ultimate form of strength, the kind that makes weakness impossible rather than simply unlikely. This is the promise of silent healing. Not merely recovery from what has been lost, but transformation into something that cannot be lost. Not merely survival of what others have done to destroy us, but evolution into someone who cannot be destroyed because destruction itself has become impossible. Not merely the healing of old wounds, but the development of capabilities that make new wounds irrelevant. Those who walk this path discover that revenge becomes unnecessary, not because they have forgiven their enemies, but because they have outgrown the need for enemies entirely. They learn that power becomes effortless, not because they have eliminated all obstacles, but because they have developed beyond the level where obstacles matter. They achieve something that seems impossible from the perspective of ordinary human experience. They become truly free. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has eliminated everything in himself that destruction could touch. He has achieved mastery not over his circumstances, but over his response to his circumstances. And in doing so, he has discovered the ultimate secret of human potential. That strength, properly understood, is not the ability to resist what the world does to us, but the ability to transform what the world does to us into the raw material of our own further development. This is the deepest teaching of silent healing and the highest achievement of human development. The transformation of oneself into someone who grows stronger through challenge, who becomes wiser through betrayal, who develops greater capabilities through opposition. The man who achieves this transformation has not merely survived his destroyers, he has used them as stepping stones to a level of existence they could never reach or even comprehend. He has achieved true invulnerability, not the brittle immunity of the person who avoids all risk, but the anti-fragile strength of the person who transforms every challenge into an opportunity for further transcendence.